You are purveying in the currency of emotion as a storyteller. Over the past 2 years, we've released over 550 car stories on the VINwiki YouTube channel. It's crazy to think about that volume or body of work, but over the course of doing so, a lot of us have gotten considerably better at telling stories. And prior to starting all this, I didn't really fancy myself as that much of a storyteller. I knew a lot of guys that I would absolutely have said, he is a terrific storyteller, but it wasn't ever something I'd spent a lot of time cultivating. And I had spent some time in the prior year putting together some of my best car stories as introductions to chapters for my book about the New York to LA record. Because quite honestly, that story of three guys going really fast in a very undramatic way in a car and then doing something that we felt was significant wasn't that compelling. And that worked well as kind of a vessel to keep the momentum and the reader's attention going, because actually assembling that drive into a normal story format was really, really hard for me. And so I wanted to create a video talking about how you tell a great story. Obviously, we tell car stories, but the same format is true regardless of what you're trying to put together. And I wanted it to be an educational resource for our viewers, but also for our storytellers, because even though it might look like all these stories are told in this really coherent, logical, progressing fashion from start to finish, that's not really how it goes. I mean, there's some of us that at this point can tell one in 1 or 2 takes, but in general, there's a lot of cuts. And that's because people don't always think about composing a story in exactly the right way to captivate the audience's attention and to make sure that they control the narrative throughout. But in most cases, we end up chopping it together and rearranging the order of what's actually said so that it follows generally this format. Because in my opinion, any story should have 4 key components. It should have just enough backstory for the context to make sense. It should have some drama, something interesting, something exciting or entertaining. It should have a resolution, a payoff, a punchline, something that you actually get to as an ending. It shouldn't just be open-ended. And there should be some kind of a moral, a life lesson, something that the audience can take away feeling like they've grown through hearing your story. And if you have all 4 of those things, generally, it's going to be a good one. And when I sit there listening to people tell stories right here, my hope is that I hear all of those things come out at some point. Now, they may not be in order, but hopefully they all sort of exist there so that I can at least chop it into something useful. So as we talk about what makes for a really good story, I'll use an example of one of my absolute favorite car stories that I've ever heard. It was Tony's Countach story. Now, Tony was a coworker of mine at the Panos Racing School and Audi driving experience. And he told a story about a drive that he had in a Lamborghini Countach that I just thought was absolutely perfect as far as car stories go. And when he would tell it, he would give us just a little bit of backstory. And for him, it was that in the early 90s, he was working for a specific car collector as sort of the caretaker of his collection of about 15 or 20 cars. And at that point in, I think, 1991, his boss had just purchased a Chevrolet Corvette ZR1. And so they were headed up to Gainesville from somewhere in Atlanta to pick this car up. And so they were going up Georgia 400, which at the time was a freshly paved goat trail to nowhere. And his boss said to him, he said, "Tony, let's take the Countach so on the way back you can drive it and we'll see which car is faster." So that paints the picture of what we're about to hear. It tells us the setting, who's involved, what Tony was doing, and it doesn't get bogged down in Tony's full biography of why he knows things about cars or what it was really like day to day. None of that really matters for us to understand the story. Now, of course, a lot of people sit here and they just want to tell their life story, but that's not really what we're in for. What we want is something that happens in a moment, in a day, in a short period of time, the kind of thing that you would tell a friend at the bar. A lot of our stories begin with just like, tell me the craziest thing that ever happened to you in a car. Don't tell me why you love cars. Don't tell me why you know about cars. Don't tell me why I should care about what you have to say. Just tell me enough that I understand what you're about to tell me. Think of it as though you're sitting across from a lifelong friend, someone that knows every single thing about you, that you'd never have to explain anything about the context of a story. But then in the course of starting to tell this story, someone else joins the conversation. Maybe they're good friends with your friend, but you don't know them. And this is what you've got to do to catch them up. It could be, at this period of time, I was working in this job, I was driving this car, I was doing this event that's generally like this. But it shouldn't ever take more than 30 or 45 seconds to establish enough backstory for the rest of the story to make sense. You'll also hear people talk about a hook. Now, I didn't include that as one of the 4 things because that's what we do on YouTube in this medium with a title. The title, the thumbnail should all draw you in. It should be something that's so sensational, so crazy that you just have to know what the story really is. Now, we double down on that the way that we edit VINwiki Car Stories by taking the most salacious, the most outrageous, the craziest line from the story and throwing that in right off the bat. Then we roll our intro and then we go right into the story. And we do that because we want people to hear, wow, that somehow is going to fit into the context of this ridiculous story. And we hope to have some little soundbite that someone's just got to hear how that makes any sense. And so then you tell the story. There should be some drama. There should be some concern. You are purveying in the currency of emotion as a storyteller. So I want the listener to become invested, to become engaged, to care about what happens through this dramatic point. So I'm raising the stakes, I'm painting a picture, I'm using colorful language, and I'm making sure that they understand what I'm talking about. I don't just talk about that a car was driving down the road. I talk about how it feels. I talk about what you're thinking. I talk about the risks that keep increasing as you understand what's going on through this story. And in doing so, I increase the investment that the listener has in the outcome. And so in Tony's story in the Countach, they make it up to Gainesville, they pick up the Corvette, and then they turn around and they're headed south on Georgia 400. And unsurprisingly, the heroic Lamborghini just takes off and leaves the Corvette in the dust. And so Tony has a great deal of separation and is just blasting along. And he tells us that he was going about 300 kilometers an hour, which is about 186 miles per hour. And he's all by himself just blasting down the road, coming down a hill towards another uphill stretch, and over the hill crests a police officer. And he sees the cop, and before the cop even sees him, but obviously he is just flying, and so he knows that he's about to be pulled over, and so he goes ahead and pulls to the shoulder. Now it takes some time for this police officer to come past him, turn around through the median, and then pull up behind Tony with his lights finally on. And he walks up to Tony's car and he says, "Wow, I'm surprised you stopped." And he said, "Yeah, I just didn't feel like running today." He says, "Well, you can't outrun the radio." And he says, "Well, I was going about 3 miles a minute, so I feel like I had a shot." And the cop kind of laughs a little bit, but he says, "Is this your car?" And he says, "You know what? It's not." And that starts to prepare us for what might become a pretty difficult situation for Tony. And so now we've got to move towards the resolution. It might be a punchline in a comedy sketch. It might be a lesson that we're going to learn through how this gets resolved or what bad outcomes Tony experiences. But it just sets the stage that we're at a very, very pivotal moment in this story where it could kind of go either way. Obviously, going that fast is an arrestable offense in many cases. Obviously, his boss might be pretty upset about it. The suspense is built and we're ready for the payoff. And stories need to have a payoff. They need to have something that unties the knot, the denouement of the story, where everything starts to make sense. We realize what the actual outcome is. In the case of this story, kind of the ending, the resolution is that the cop says, "Tony, is this your car?" And Tony says, "You know what? It's not. It belongs to my boss." And the cop says, "Well, what does your boss think of you driving it like that?" And poetically, Tony says, "Well, you can ask him in just a moment." And at that very moment, the boss comes flying by, not braking at all for Tony or the cop on the side of the road, well over 100 miles an hour in this Corvette, blows their doors off, and he pulls on over and walks up. And the cop's like, "What on earth's going on?" He's like, "It's all right. That's how I wanted him to drive it." Well, the cop ends up taking Tony to jail, and his boss comes in and bails him out and ends up paying a $5,000 and 1991 dollars fine for Tony's release. And there's some legal troubles and things like that that follow, because what really ended up happening is that even beyond the trouble he didn't get into with his boss and the tickets and things that he could kind of buy his way out of with his boss's help, Tony still had this terrible, terrible speeding ticket on his record. And for the next 5 years, Tony struggled to get insurance. And so to us, as the listening audience at this racing school that are young and excited about our driving skills and all the things that we're going to get to do, this is kind of saying you can't anticipate all of the difficulties and all the things that could happen from driving recklessly or outrageously on the road. And so he is kind of explaining that even though he didn't really get in trouble with his boss and he really was able to keep his driver's license since he didn't show up and a lawyer showed up on his behalf and kind of dealt with everything the way Ticket Clinic might help you do it today, he still couldn't keep that great dream job because he couldn't legally operate a car because he didn't have insurance. And so there's all these layers of consequence that you might have in the event that you do something crazy in a car. And so that was kind of his message to us, along with the fact that it was just entertaining, because sometimes the destination is just a punchline. If you look at Rob Pitt's story about selling a Camaro to a porn star, it's interesting and he paints a vivid picture of what this lady looks like. But at the end of the story, everything was really a setup to deliver just such a perfect closing line where this muscly, big for nothing boyfriend of the porn star is standing in his shop talking about all he knows about cars and talking about his conquests of old. And he brags to Rob saying, "You know what? I've slept with every woman in this county except for my mother and sister." And Rob immediately jabs back, "Well, between the two of us, we got them all." And if you can deliver a punchline like that, I mean, what could you honestly ask for beyond it? And so having something like that to really pay it off, but then hopefully incorporating a lesson, just like Tony did, that there's something the audience can learn from this ending, from this story, that makes it valuable, that makes it worth listening to, that makes it worth saying, hey, Tony, come over here and tell them your Countach story whenever there's someone else around. And you want it to be that kind of story. I mean, that should be your hook. That should be your clickbait. Your title is, tell them about the time that this happened. We just had a story told yesterday about a time where a storyteller almost got shot by the cops for picking his nose. And all of this structure serves that when you get to the end of it, you don't end up with this, "Oh, okay," or, "Well, I guess you had to be there" sentiment for the listener. You want them to feel like, "Wow, I never saw that coming. I'm so glad that I spent whatever amount of time," usually in our case, something between 8 and 12 minutes, listening to that amazing story. And we want to be able to immortalize great stories because people deserve to hear great stories even beyond the normal spheres of influence that a person might have. I mean, the fact that we can now expose a great car story to an audience of millions makes for a ton of fun. And that's why we really started the VINwiki channel. And so I hope that you've enjoyed hearing the stories that we have. I hope you're out there making stories of your own. But regardless, I hope that once you have a great story, that you're great at telling it. Shrewd negotiation starts with finding the right car, and the best way to do that is with Autotempest.com. Autotempest allows you to compare the results from Craigslist nationally with all the top listing sites. So visit Autotempest.com today and see where your next dream car is hiding.